All right, leading the NFL in running back rushing yards is Rico Dowdle by a long way, honestly. Like I said, Rico Dowdle this week had 206 yards. That's the most. Only player so far this season over 200 yards. Welcome to Just the Stats NFL. This is a new version of what I've been trying to do. I'm still messing with the podcast, but I think I'm going to like this new format. Instead of doing a breakdown of every game and who I think is going to win and still looking at the people and so forth, I'm going to stick to the top 10s, which is something I like, whether it's a top 10s who had the best games this last week during the season, and maybe if it drops into the all-time category as well. So we'll track all that for different positions. And then also on one day a week, I will look at the standings, I'll look at the coaches, and I'll look at the rookies. So we'll go through that every week and see how these standings change, who had a big game in the past week, like, for example, this week 5. So that's the idea. So, like I said, I'm Ernie Jennings, your host, and I'm hoping that I like this podcast and that you will as well. But I've been tinkering with it. I can't do 20. I did 27 podcasts last week. That's just not going to work. Trying to do every game individually, that's just too many podcasts. And I kind of came down to the idea that I do like the numbers, though. So let's see if we give this a shot and how it works. So we're going to start out this way. We'll do the current week. Then I'll look at the season, and then I'll see if any of the players have fallen into the all-time category. I can tell you right now, no, on the all-time numbers. But this past week, Matthew Stafford led the NFL in passing yards with 389. There were only 4 quarterbacks this week to throw for 300 or more yards, and it was actually 340 yards, which was pretty impressive. Because then the next one was Justin Fields in 5th with only 283. So huge gap between the top 4 and the number 5 spot. But even though Matthew Stafford threw for 389 yards, it was in a loss to the San Francisco 49ers, 26-23. Tough game. Baker Mayfield had the next best score with 379 yards, and that was in a very close win, 38-35. What a crazy game that was. Mac Jones had an incredible game against the very same Rams where Stafford had 389. Mac Jones had 342 yards in his backup role. Really big game for him. Took a lot of hits. He looked like he was about to keel over, but he hung in there the entire game and really did a good job in that backup role. And then Sam Darnold was the last quarterback to throw for over 300 yards, and he threw for 341 in the loss to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 38-35. So it's pretty interesting that the top 4 numbers are by the 4 quarterbacks in the 2 games, in the same 2 games for the for the Rams versus San Francisco and Tampa Bay versus Seattle. All the top 4 quarterbacks came from those 2 games. That's pretty interesting. All right, those are your top 10. What I'm going to be trying to do is put the listing up on the podcast if you're watching it on YouTube. But at this point, I just wanted to get this out there. I have to do a lot of podcasts because I'm going on a little vacation. So now looking at passing TDs, this past week, 3 quarterbacks threw for 4 touchdown passes in a single game. It was Sam Darnold for Seattle in that loss to Tampa Bay, C.J. Stroud for Houston against Baltimore. What a crushing defeat on Baltimore that was, 44-10. And generally, you're going to win if you throw 4 touchdown passes. But in this case, Sam Darnold did not win, but the other quarterbacks did. And then Dak Prescott for Dallas threw 4 touchdowns against the New York Jets in their 37-22 win. I only listed 7, even though there's top 10 this is supposed to be a top 10, but there's too many that had 2 touchdowns. There were 4 quarterbacks that had 3: Matthew Stafford, Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa, and Jake Browning. Unfortunately for Jake Browning, he also threw 3 interceptions. So that's kind of defeating his own intent there. Speaking of interceptions, let's look at that. 2 quarterbacks did throw for 3 interceptions. That was Jake Browning in the loss to Detroit, 37-24. And then Cooper Rush filling in for Jackson. He threw 3 interceptions against Houston in Baltimore's 44-10 loss. So pretty rough. 2 not rookies, but 2 backup quarterbacks filling in, and neither one really did that great. Jake Browning did a little better, even though he did have the 3 interceptions. He did have 2 touchdown passes, so that kind of offset it a little bit. All right. Now, those are the top 2. Then we also had, there's only 9 quarterbacks actually in these last games that threw an interception, period. Geno Smith threw 2, Jackson Dart threw 2, and then we had 5 quarterbacks that threw 1. So interesting. And a stat that's telling in this is out of the 9, 7 of the teams lost. Cam Ward threw an interception, but were able to win. They were able to win that game, Tennessee against Arizona, 22-21. Cam Ward had been looking for a victory, so that was nice for him. And then Bryce Young threw an interception early in the Miami game, but they came storming back to beat Miami 27-24. So pretty impressive for him. All right. Now, looking at the running backs. Who would have thought that the first running back to rush for over 200 yards this season would be Rico Dowdle for Carolina Panthers? He was just filling in for Chuba Hubbard, and he ends up rushing for 206 yards on 23 carries. That was by far the best game of the best yardage this week and this season. We'll look at that in a couple minutes. Javonte Williams for Dallas, who's been a pleasant surprise for Dallas. He had 135 yards on 16 carries in the Dallas's win over New York Jets, 37-22. And Dowdle for Carolina was part of the process of them coming back from Miami to win 27-24. And then Breece Hall in that game against Dallas, he also had 113 yards, though he did have a fumble. He was having a pretty good game. That was a loss for the Jets, 37-22. 113 yards on 14 carries. And then Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt for the Commanders had 14 carries for 111 yards. And that was in a surprising win, honestly, I thought, over the Chargers, 27-10. And then Quinshon Judkins against Cleveland had 23 carries for 110 yards. He has looked super impressive. And to get 110 yards against the Cleveland Browns defense is really good. It'll be fun to watch him as he continues to play and continues to just understand how to play even. I mean, he jumped right into the frying pan, right? No training, nothing, and he's already one of the top running backs. But all for naught for him because it wasn't a loss to Minnesota 21-17. Those are the only 5 running backs that had 100 or more yards this week. Interesting also, Amari DiMarcado for Arizona in a backup role. Well, actually, he's now the starter because they've lost the first 2 starters they had. He did rush for 81 yards, but only on 3 carries. It's kind of crazy. And that was just unfortunate. One of those, you would have thought they learned from the previous week. 71 yards he had, and he drops the ball going into the end zone, fumble. Just unbelievable mistake. Terrible. Arizona has found the most interesting ways to lose games. All right, that's a look at those. Let's look at the rushing TDs. I've only got 4 listed, but I'm only going to mention that Jonathan Taylor rushed for 3 touchdowns, and there were 3 for Indianapolis against the Las Vegas Raiders. In their Indianapolis Colts crushed the Raiders 40-6. He only rushed for 66 yards. That's Jonathan Taylor on 17 carries, 3.9 yard average, but had 3 touchdowns. And then Ja'Cory Krosky Merritt, in that good game he had when he rushed for 111 yards, also had 2 touchdowns. Rashad White for Tampa Bay, 2 touchdowns, rushed it 14 times for 41 yards, so only 2.9 yards a rush. But Bucky Irving was out of the game, so he filled in. I'm sure they'll be ready to get Irving back, despite the fact that White was able to score those 2 touchdowns. And then Ramondre Stevenson continues to split the time with Travion Henderson, and he only had 7 carries for 14 yards, but he did have 2 touchdowns. So Jonathan Taylor ends up another week with 3 touchdowns rushing. That's pretty amazing, and we'll see what that means when we get to the seasonal numbers. All right, let's look at the receivers. Stephon Diggs this week was number 1 wide receiver. Again, I don't know if I'd have picked that. I wouldn't have picked either of the first 2, actually. But we'll start with receptions, actually, not the yards, but we'll do a reception. But Stephon Diggs, Kendrick Bourne, and Puka Nacua all had 10 receptions this week. Stephon Diggs also led the league this week in yardage. And then looking at beyond the 10 that they had, Mason Taylor, tight end for the Jets versus Dallas, had 9 receptions. So good game for him. And then we had several players with 8 receptions. Now looking at the yards, and I was wrong about Stephon Diggs. He was second in yardage to Emeka Egbuka. Only had 7 catches, but 163 yards, averaged over 23 yards a carry, a reception. Incredible game for him. Touchdown. He's been such an impressive rookie so far this year. Then, like I said, Stephon Diggs came in second with 146 yards. We're the top 11 receivers all had over 110 or more yards. A lot of yards there. Stephon Diggs, 10 catches, 146 yards. Kendrick Bourne for San Francisco, like I said, another one I wouldn't have thought being at the top here, had 10 catches for 142 yards in their San Francisco's win over the Rams. That game, the Rams had such a difficult time stopping the intermediate passes. Coming in fourth, Jackson Smith-Njigba for Seattle, and their loss to Tampa Bay had 8 catches for 132 yards and a touchdown, average 16.5 yards a carry. He's been super good this year. Fifth, another surprise who everybody thought should have been a good receiver to start with, hadn't had a good week yet. And when everybody starts to think about dropping him from their fantasy teams and so forth, Calvin Ridley shows up for Tennessee with 5 catches, 131 yards, averaged over 26 yards a catch. So first big game that he's had, and Tennessee ended up winning that game against Arizona 22-21. Justin Jefferson, another good game for him, 7 catches, 123 yards. And then we had 3 players, all with 114 and 2 more with 110. So a lot of receivers with 100 or plus yards. Now looking at receiving touchdowns this week, 6 players had 2 receiving touchdowns. Jamar Chase for Cincinnati in a loss to Detroit. Kyron Williams, a running back for the Rams, in a loss to San Francisco. A.J. Barner, tight end for Seattle, in a loss again against Tampa Bay. Then Jake Ferguson, another tight end, with 2 touchdowns in a win over the Jets. Theo Johnson, 2 touchdown receptions in a loss to the Saints. He had 6 catches for only 33 yards. Even more than that was Xavier Hutchinson, wide receiver for Houston. 2 touchdown receptions in their win over the Ravens. He had 2 touchdowns. He only caught 3 passes for 18 yards. 2 of them were touchdowns. I guess if you're only going to catch a few passes, them all being touchdowns is the way to go. All right, so let's look at this season so far then. Who are the top 10 passing in passing yards right so far this season? Well, Russell Wilson, who's since been benched, still leads this season in most passing yards by quite a distance over Josh Allen. Russell Wilson in week 2 had 450 passing yards in that game. And that was good enough to tie him for 4th all-time in Giants history for most yards, and that was in a loss for them. Josh Allen's second so far this season with 394 yards, which was good enough in a win for him, but it's also 9th all-time in Bills history, a tie for 9th all-time in Bills history, 394 yards. And then this week, and then that's the top 2, but this week, week 5, 4 people jumped into the top 10 as far as most passing yards in a single game. And that was Matthew Stafford, 389 in their loss, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Baker Mayfield had 379 yards in a win. Mac Jones for the 49ers, 342, and Sam Darnold, 341. So 4 players jumped into the top 10. But still, Russell Wilson, that 450, that's going to be a hard one to top by anybody. Now, looking at touchdown passes, Jared Goff leads the NFL this season in touchdown passes with 5, which he did in week 2. And then there's been 6 players who've thrown for 4, including 3 that did it this week. Dak Prescott had 4, Sam Darnold had 4, and C.J. Stroud had 4. Now, for Jared Goff, that tied for first all-time in Lions history for most touchdown passes in a single game. Now, for Aaron Rodgers, he threw 4 in week 1 for the Steelers in their win, which tied him for 9th all-time in Steelers history. And then one more, Lamar Jackson in week 2 threw 4 touchdowns for the Ravens in their only victory. Who would have thought that going into after the 5th week of the season, only 1 victory for the Ravens. But it did tie him for 9th all-time in Ravens history with 4 touchdown passes. And then C.J. Stroud for the Texans in their win, his 4 touchdowns tied him for 8th all-time in Texans history. All right, one more. Oh, yeah. Caleb Williams for the Bears also threw 4 touchdowns in week 3, which is good enough for 4th all-time in Bears history. Tied for 4th all-time. All right, looking at interceptions this season so far. And this is just unfortunate. The Raiders grabbed Geno Smith with the hope that he could really flip this team, and he's already had 2 out of 5 weeks with 3 interceptions. That is not good. Him and Jake Browning are both on this list twice. There's only 5 times that a quarterback is thrown for 3 interceptions, and there's only 3 players. Geno Smith's done it twice. Jake Browning's done it twice. Jake Browning did it in week 2 in a win, the only win, which was an unbelievable, shocking win over the Jaguars. And then Jake Browning again did it this week. He had 3 interceptions. Cooper Rush for the Ravens this week also had 3 interceptions. So 2 of them are backup. Geno Smith is supposed to be a good quarterback, but he's just, like I said in a previous podcast, seems like he's hoping he'll just throw it up there and hope somebody catches it. And that's not going to work. All right, leading the NFL in running back rushing yards is Rico Dowdle by a long way, honestly. Like I said, Rico Dowdle this week had 206 yards. That's the most. Only player so far this season over 200 yards. And in fact, Derrick Henry's second in week 1, he had the record, not the record, but he had the leading total for rushing yards until this week. Derrick Henry had 169 yards for the Ravens in a loss in week 1. That was the highest. So Rico Dowdle just crushed that. 206. We'll see who else can make it to 200 yards this season. I'm sure somebody will. Jonathan Taylor had 165 yards in week 2. That's the 3rd best. Now this week also, Javonte Williams made it to the 8th spot on the list with 135 yards. So only 2 players were able to get onto the top 10 in rushing yards this season, and that was Rico Dowdle and Javonte Williams. All right, we're looking at rushing touchdowns. There's only one player to look at. He's had 3 touchdowns twice. No one else has had 3 rushing touchdowns in a game so far. Jonathan Taylor's done it twice in week 3 and then this past week. Only player so far to do that. All right, let's look at the receivers and let's look at receptions. So far this year, and I've only got 4 here because there's a ton of receivers with 10 receptions. But right now, Jamar Chase leads the NFL this season in most receptions in a single game with 14 he had in week 2. That's the second best all-time in Bengals history. Now, Jake Ferguson and Puka Nacua both have 13 receptions. Jake Ferguson for the Cowboys in a loss, but that was good enough to tie him for 4th all-time in Cowboys history. And then Puka Nacua had 13 in a win in week 4, which was good enough to tie him for 9th all-time in Rams history. And Puka Nacua also had 11 receptions in week 3. Those are the top 4 numbers. And like I said, Puka Nacua has several 10 reception, or a couple of those as well. So he's been overall the leading receiver. We'll look at that when we look at the single season numbers. Now, looking at most receiving yards in a single game so far this season. Leading the NFL right now is Puka Nacua with 170 yards. He had in a win in week 4. And unfortunately, sad because Malik Neighbors might be up here even more, but he was number 2 for the Giants. He had 167 yards in week 2. And unfortunately, he's out for the season, so that's going to be it for him. Those are your top 2. Jamar Chase in week 2 had 165. Now this week, jumping into the number 4 and number 5 spotter, Mika Egbuka for the Buccaneers in a win. He had 163 yards. And then Stephon Diggs just last night had 146 yards in a win. So those 2 jumped into the top 10, as did Kendrick Bourne for the 49ers, jumping into the 8th spot with 142 yards in his team's win. So those are some of your top 10 lists there. So far, only 170 yards is leading the NFL this season. All right, let's receiving touchdown. There's 3 players that have 3 touchdowns in a single game. None of them were this week, though. Amon-Ra St. Brown, the Lions, in a win. This is very interesting. Romeo Doubs for the Packers had 3 in week 4 in a tie. And Trey Tucker for the Raiders had 3 in week 3 for a loss. So you got a win, tie, loss here in receiving touchdowns. Kind of showing, you would think, honestly, if you have enough 3 touchdown games that you're going to win, but not the case here. All right, let's look at the defense a little bit in interceptions. Right now we have 6 players with 2 interceptions in a single game, including 2 that did it this week. Jalen Petrie, defensive back for the Texans, and then Kool-Aid McKinstry, defensive back for the Saints. They had 2 this week to make it into the top 6 so far. There's only 6 players. And the same goes for sacks. There's only 4 listed because there's quite a few that have had 2 sacks in a single game, but only 4 that had more than that. And Tuli Tuipulotu, a linebacker for the Chargers in a loss actually, had 4 sacks in week 4. And then you've got 3 players that have 2.5 sacks in a single game. 2 with a win and 1 with a loss. Interesting. Including Nick Benito, linebacker for the Broncos, who had 2.5 sacks yesterday in that game, in that win against the Eagles. All right, let's look at the all-time numbers. There aren't any players. Well, let's put it this way. There's no numbers this season so far that make it into the top 10 in any category that you want to look at. But what I'm going to mention here is just that there are a few players who are currently playing that have top 10 numbers, all-time top 10 numbers. That's Joe Burrow. In 2021, threw for 529 yards in a win. Matthew Stafford, 520 yards in a loss in 2012. And Jared Goff That was when Matthew Stafford was with the Lions. He threw for 520 yards and a loss. And then Jared Goff, when he was with the Rams, threw for 517 yards and a loss in 2019. Those are the only passing yards. No one's thrown for the most touchdowns, which is 7, or probably never will we see a receiver throw the most interceptions in a single game again, which is 8, or 7 is the next highest. Now, looking at the running backs, there's none again, like I said, but there are 2 that are active that are on the top 10 all-time list in rushing yards in a single game. And that's Saquon Barkley, who did it last year. He had 255 yards last year in a win. And then Jonathan Taylor for the Colts, had 253 yards in 2021. Those are the only 2 players that are on the top 10 list. Now, rushing TDs, only 1 player active, and that's Alvin Kamara, who's the all-time leader in rushing TDs with 6. He did that in 2020. So the only player was 6, and then there's 4 players with 5. Looking at receiving yardage, this is pretty interesting. Only 1 player is in the top. Well, there's 16 players, but there's several players, 7 players tied for 9th with 16 receptions. One of those being Keenan Allen. In 2020, he had 16 receptions in a single game, which is not even his best. He's also got the number 3 all-time reception total with 18 he had for the Chargers in 2023. So he's the only active player on this list, and he's on here twice. Pretty impressive. No players in the top 10 in receiving yards or touchdowns. All right, well, that is a wrap at this. Next up will be a look at the season numbers, and some pretty interesting numbers here, and we'll see who's moved where on the season totals for different players going into what we look at for the next podcast. Appreciate you listening. I hope you like this. I kind of like all these numbers and who's in the top 10. Like I said, I will be working on putting this up on the podcast, or if you're watching it, you'll see these numbers up on the screen as well, which will make it a lot easier for you to see all the numbers, because I'm not just reading down 1 through 10. I just want to list players who are currently playing this week for the most part. But seeing this was the first one, I might have mentioned a few more players as well. All right. I appreciate it if you like and subscribe to this podcast. You can find it on YouTube at Just the Stats NFL, also on any of your podcast sites, Spotify, Apple podcast apps that you may have. If you don't find it, let me know. You can also contact me at Just the Stats NFL. So like I said, I appreciate you listening, and that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, I am out.